What happens to a person who is raised so far above ordinary life that the world beneath them becomes invisible, and then that world rises up to reclaim everything? Marie Antoinette did not cause the French Revolution, but she became its most visible symbol, which in the end amounted to the same thing. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara.
The question at the center of this episode is not whether she deserved her fate, but what her story tells us about the distance between power and the people who sustain it, and what happens when that distance becomes too great to survive. Tonight, we turn to Marie Antoinette, not as caricature, but as a young woman shaped by forces she did not choose and trapped inside a world she could not see clearly enough to escape. We ask what it means when a monarchy mistakes privilege for permanence, and what the cost of that mistake looks like.
To understand Marie Antoinette, you must first understand the world she was born into, because it was not a world that allowed its inhabitants to understand any other. She was born in Vienna.
We are speaking about Marie Antoinette and the world of the French monarchy at the end of its age.
A world in which palaces were political instruments, marriages were diplomatic treaties, and the lives of royal children were managed as assets of the state from the moment of their birth.
Then let us begin with the dynasty that formed her, and the court that would consume her.
The Habsburg dynasty had ruled a vast and complicated empire from Vienna for centuries. Maria Theresa was one of its most formidable rulers, a woman who governed an empire of millions while raising 16 children and conducting foreign policy with the precision of a chess player. Her children were not simply her children. They were her instruments. In the middle of the 18th century, Austria and France had recently concluded an alliance that reversed more than 2 centuries of rivalry. To seal that alliance in a form that courts of the era understood as binding, a marriage was arranged. The youngest Habsburg Archduchess would be sent to Versailles to marry the heir to the French throne.
So she was chosen not for herself, but for her bloodline and the political convenience it represented.
Yes, Maria Antonia was 14 years old when the preparations for her departure began. She received accelerated instruction in French language, French manners, and the specific rituals of the Bourbon court. Everything about her was reoriented toward a country she had never visited, and a role she had not chosen. At the border between Austria and France, she underwent a ritual stripping. In a tent, on a small island in the Rhine, she was required to remove every item of Austrian clothing and every Austrian attendant. She entered France having given up everything she had arrived with. Even her dog was taken from her. She crossed the border as a French possession.
So her transformation into a French queen began with an act of complete erasure.
Yes. She was married to Louis Auguste, the future Louis XVI, in May of 1770. He was 15, she was 14. Neither had chosen the other. Neither had much to say about the arrangement. The French court watched the ceremony with the critical attention of a population that had invested enormous symbolic weight in the union between these two dynasties. What she arrived into at Versailles was one of the most elaborate and suffocating human environments ever constructed. The Palace of Versailles was not simply a residence. It was an instrument of political control designed by Louis XIV to keep the French nobility under constant royal supervision. Its scale was calculated to overwhelm. Its rituals were designed to consume every hour of every day.
So Versailles was simultaneously a monument and a trap.
For everyone inside it, yet, the daily life of the royal family was a sequence of ceremonies so rigidly prescribed that even the act of waking was a public performance. Dozens of courtiers had the right to attend the royal dressing, the royal meals, the royal walks. Privacy, in the sense that an ordinary person would recognize it, was almost non-existent. For a teenage girl from Vienna, the adjustment was extreme. Marie Antoinette was watched constantly, judged on her posture, her expression, her dress, her manner of eating, her ability to remember the names and ranks of thousands of courtiers, and her success in producing Anne. For the first 7 years of the marriage, that last requirement was not met, which generated sustained anxiety at court and sustained cruelty from those watching.
So she was a teenager under permanent public scrutiny, in a foreign country, in a marriage that was not working, surrounded by people whose interests did not align with hers.
Yes, and her response was understandable if politically disastrous. She retreated into pleasure. The only domain in which she had any real autonomy was consumption, fashion, entertainment, gambling, theater, music, the cultivation of a small circle of intimate friends. These were the arenas in which she could exercise preference rather than protocol. Her taste in fashion became famous and then infamous. She worked closely with the designer Rose Bertin, commissioning elaborate constructions of fabric and ornaments that were the subject of fascination and satire across Europe. Her hairstyles rose to extraordinary heights. Her spending on clothing was enormous, even by the standards of the court.
So fashion became the visible expression of everything people would come to hate about her.
Yes, but it is worth pausing on what that spending actually represented in context. The amounts Marie Antoinette spent on clothing, though considerable, were a small fraction of the French state's expenditure, and a negligible fraction of its debt. The real fiscal crisis of the French monarchy had far deeper and more structural causes. France had emerged from decades of expensive warfare, including support for the American Revolution, carrying a debt load that its tax system could not service. The tax system itself was profoundly unjust. The nobility and the clergy, who held most of the wealth, were largely exempt from taxation. The burden fell on the peasantry and the urban poor, who had the least.
So the financial crisis was systemic, not the result of one woman's wardrobe.
Yes, but this is a turning point in understanding the political history of Marie Antoinette. The question is not what actually caused the crisis, but what the population came to believe caused it. And in the pamphlets, the gossip, and the popular imagination of the 1780s, the Queen became the embodiment of everything wrong with the monarchy. Her retreat to the Petit Trianon, a small palace within the Versailles grounds where she cultivated a private world of gardens, theatre, and intimate gatherings, was understood by the public not as an escape from Versailles' suffocating protocol of the main palace, but as an extravagance funded by the suffering of ordinary people. She had created what amounted to an artificial pastoral fantasy, while bread prices rose and harvests failed.
So the Petit Trianon, whatever its actual cost, became a symbol of detachments that no amount of explanation could undo.
Exactly. And the diamond necklace affair of 1785 accelerated this transformation in her public image decisively, even though she was entirely innocent of any wrongdoing in the matter. The affair involved an elaborate fraud in which a confidence artist named Jean de la Motte convinced a cardinal that the Queen wished to secretly purchase an extraordinarily expensive diamond necklace through his intermediary. The Queen had never been involved. The cardinal had been deceived. But the story that spread through Paris was that the Queen had commissioned a necklace of obscene value while the poor went hungry.
So a fraud she had nothing to do with became the proof of everything people already believed about her.
Yes, the pamphlets multiplied. The nickname Madame Deficit attached itself to her and would not let go. Satirical prints circulated depicting her as a foreign parasite draining the resources of France. The letters L.A. and D for Autrichienne, which means Austrian woman but sounds close to a French insult, became a common way of referring to her in hostile publications. By the late 1780s, the hatred directed at her was not simply political. It was personal, sexualized, and vicious in ways that reflected the depth of the anger accumulating in French society. She was accused in print of virtually every vice. The accusations were largely fabricated, but the emotional energy behind them was real, and it was being fed by genuine suffering.
She became the face of a structural injustice she had not created.
Yes, and this is where the story becomes genuinely tragic rather than simply historical. The crisis she was blamed for, the debt, the inequality, the failure of reform, had been building for generations before she arrived. The aristocratic system that surrounded her was incapable of the reforms that might have preserved it. The king, though not unintelligent, was indecisive and unable to force the privileged classes to accept the taxation that might have resolved the fiscal emergency. In 1789, the Estates General was convened for the first time since 1614, an extraordinary measure driven by the collapse of royal finances. What was intended as a mechanism for managing the crisis became the forum in which the Third Estate, representing the vast majority of the French population, began to assert claims that the existing order could not accommodate it.
So the attempt to manage the crisis created the conditions for revolution.
Yes, the events of 1789 moved with a speed that left the royal family and the entire aristocratic world struggling to understand what was happening. The storming of the Bastille in July was not simply a prison riot. It was a signal that the population of Paris was no longer willing to be managed. The symbol of royal authority fell to a crowd that the monarchy had no reliable means of stopping. In October, the Women's March on Versailles brought thousands of Parisian women to the palace gates, driven by hunger and fury. The royal family was compelled to relocate to Paris, to the Tuileries Palace, where they would live effectively as prisoners of the revolution while retaining the formal title of monarch.
So the world of Versailles, which had been the entire frame of her existence, simply ceased to exist around her.
Yes, and this is where the portrait of Marie Antoinette becomes more complicated and more human. The historical record from this period shows a woman who had genuinely evolved. She had become more politically engaged, more aware of the danger, more willing to think strategically about survival than she had been in her years of fashion and theatre. The frivolous Dauphine of the 1770s was not the person navigating the crisis of the 1790s, but the image the public had of her was fixed. Whatever she had become, the pamphlets continued to circulate, and the name Madame Deficit followed her into captivity. The revolution did not need the actual Marie Antoinette. It needed the symbol, and the symbol had long since detached from the person.
So the person and the symbol had become entirely separate things.
Yes, and the flight to Varennes in June of 1791 made that separation final. The royal family attempted to flee France disguised as ordinary travelers, intending to reach the Austrian border, and from there coordinate a foreign intervention to restore the monarchy. They were recognized and arrested at Varennes within reach of the border, and brought back to Paris under humiliating conditions. Whatever residual sympathy remained for the monarchy evaporated with the flight to Varennes. The king and queen had attempted to abandon their country. They had confirmed every accusation of disloyalty and foreign sympathy. From this point, the survival of the monarchy as a political institution became increasingly difficult to argue for, even among those who had previously supported reform rather than abolition.
So the flight to Varennes was not just a failed escape, it was the end of any remaining legitimacy.
Yes, first in the Tuileries under increasing restriction. Then in the Temple, Louis XVI was tried in late 1792, and his life ended at the guillotine in January of 1793. Marie Antoinette was separated from her children and transferred to the Conciergerie prison. Her final months were a reduction to almost nothing. From Versailles, from the Petit Trianon, from the elaborate rituals that had defined her existence, she arrived at a single cell with minimal furnishings, constant surveillance, and almost no company. The woman who had once required an entire apparatus of courtiers and dressmakers to begin her day now had almost nothing in.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, for those who want to understand Marie Antoinette beyond the caricature and beyond the revolution that consumed her, where would you invite them to continue?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with Marie Antoinette, The Journey by Antonia Fraser.
So this is a biography that takes the full arc of her life seriously, from Vienna to the Revolution.
It is deeply researched and genuinely nuanced. Fraser explores Marie Antoinette's life from Austrian Archduchess to French Queen, examining both the myths that accumulated around her and the human complexity beneath. She does not rehabilitate her uncritically, but she insists on treating her as a person shaped by specific historical circumstances, rather than simply as a symbol of decadence.
And is this a biography that a reader without specialist knowledge of 18th century French history can follow?
It is very accessible. Fraser writes with the narrative skill of a storyteller and the discipline of a serious historian. She provides enough context about Versailles, Habsburg politics, and the French financial crisis to orient any reader, while keeping Marie Antoinette's own experience at the center. It is a long book, but a compelling one, and it rewards the attention it asks for.
So reading it gives you a portrait of one of history's most famous women that is genuinely more complex than the image most people carry.
Yes, and it also gives you a much clearer picture of Versailles as a system, of the French monarchy as an institution in terminal crisis, and of the revolution not as a sudden eruption, but as the outcome of pressures that had been building for decades before that young girl crossed the border from Austria.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
Marie Antoinette's trial took place in October of 1793. The charges were extensive and included accusations that were fabricated and deeply cruel. Her defense was conducted under conditions that made a genuine legal process impossible. The outcome was predetermined by the political needs of the moment rather than by evidence. She went to the guillotine on October the 16th, 1793, at the age of 37. She had spent more than 2 decades in France, arrived as a child and left having outlived her husband, lost her children to the revolution, and watched an entire world dissolve around her. Whatever she had been at 14, the person who faced that morning was not the same.
So what remains of her in history? Is she a scapegoat, a symbol, or something more complicated?
She is all three, and that multiplicity is part of what makes her historically significant. She was a scapegoat, in the straightforward sense that the hatred directed at her was disproportionate to her actual culpability for the crisis of the French state. She spent money in a court where everyone of her rank spent money. She behaved in ways that were unremarkable for a Queen of Versailles, but she was also a symbol in the precise sense, a figure whose specific qualities made her exceptionally useful as a focus for accumulated anger. She was foreign, which activated existing anxieties about Austrian influence. She was a woman in a position of enormous privilege, which made her spending legible as extravagance in a way that male royal spending often was not. And she was visually present, constantly depicted in portraiture and fashion plates, which gave the pamphlet writers a recognizable face to attach their accusations to.
Though her visibility worked against her, the more recognizable she became, the more available she was as a target.
Yes, and beyond scapegoat and symbol, she was a human being, who was placed as a child in a situation she had not chosen, trained for a role that required her to suppress most of what she actually was, and then condemned for the ways in which she sought relief from that suppression. The fashion, the theatre, the Petit Trianon, these were not evidence of a defective character. They were the coping strategies of someone living inside a gilded prison. None of this means the revolution was wrong to happen, or that the aristocratic order she represented deserved to survive. The suffering that produced the revolution was real, and the demand for a more just society was legitimate. But those facts coexist with the recognition that the individual at the center of the storm was not the cause of the conditions that produced it.
So the fall of Marie Antoinette was not simply a personal fall.
No. It was the fall of an entire structure of privilege that had operated for generations on the assumption that it would continue forever. Versailles was not simply a palace. It was a belief system, a belief that the distance between the court and the people it ruled was natural, permanent, and self-justifying. That belief was maintained through the ritual, the architecture, the dress, the protocol, and the deliberate insulation from ordinary life that defined Versailles. For the people inside the palace, the world of ordinary France was not invisible because they were cruel. It was invisible because the entire structure of their existence was designed to make it so.
Though the system reproduced its own blindness from one generation to the next.
Yes, and that blindness was not a personal failing, it was structural. The question of whether Marie Antoinette was naive or trapped misses the deeper point. She was both, in ways that were inseparable. Her naivety was produced by the trap she had been placed in, and the trap had been constructed by a world that had long since confused its own comfort with the natural order of things. The lesson that her story forces into view is not flattering and not comfortable. Privilege insulates. Insulation distorts perception. Distorted perception produces decisions that accelerate the very crisis they were meant to prevent. And by the time the distance between a ruling class and the population it depends on becomes visible enough to act on, it may already be too late to act on.
So the fall of Marie Antoinette was not simply the fall of a queen.
No, it was the collapse of a world that mistook privilege for permanence. A world in which the ceremonies and the portraits and the extraordinary costumes were not vanity for its own sake, but a performance of certainty, a performance that the court believed, and that the revolution finally refused to attend. Power becomes fragile the moment it stops understanding the lives of those beneath it. Not because the people beneath will inevitably rise, though sometimes they do, but because a power that cannot see its own foundations cannot maintain them, and foundations that are not maintained eventually give way. Often suddenly, usually when those above had every reason to believe the ground was solid.
Thank you for staying with us tonight. And thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through Versailles, through the revolution, and through the life of a woman who became the face of a world that could not survive its own distance from reality.
She did not see it coming, but then no one inside Versailles did. That was never an accident. It was the point.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.